I grew up in a little rural area in western Kentucky. Any Kentuckians in the room? I met somebody in the hallway yesterday. There she is. I met her yesterday. There's a couple over here. Well, some of you may have grown up in rural environments, rural situation. And in my little town in Kentucky, Farmersville, Kentucky, if that tells you anything, my grandmother was the consummate country grandmother. My grandmother, for example, I never saw her in anything but a dress or a skirt in her entire life. I never saw her in pants. I never saw her in shorts. Certainly never saw her in a bathing suit. My grandmother lived out in the country. She did not have running water for her entire life. And she died in April of 1974. When she had to go to the restroom, she had to start early because she had to start down the path and go behind the hen house and the smokehouse out to the outhouse. My grandmother cooked on a wood stove till the day she died. And it was the food I can still remember. It was wonderful. My grandmother always wore an apron. Always wore an apron. And always had two pockets in her apron. One pocket always had a handkerchief. My grandmother told me, you can conquer the world with a handkerchief, Phil. And she always had one. And in the other pocket, she always had, she had a can of snuff. My grandmother liked to dip a little snuff. Now, let me tell you something. That was my grandmother. That's how I remember my grandmother. But the thing I remember most about my grandmother is how much she loved her grandkids. I remember one particular occasion. I was at her house and she was making homemade biscuits from scratch. It was a process that took 30, 45 minutes, I don't know, a long time. And it was perfect because it gave us time together. And I can remember her working in that kitchen. I can remember the flour on her apron. I can remember her moving around, not so quickly because she was getting a little bit older at that time. But I remember following her, and everywhere she went, I would just talk. She didn't say 5 words in 30 minutes. And that was perfect as far as I was concerned, because all I wanted her to do was listen to me. And I continued to talk as any little 5-year-old talkative boy will do until finally I remember my grandmother turning around, wiping her hands on her apron and leaning forward and saying, "Son, come here. Well, I didn't know what she wanted, but I knew I was about to get what I wanted, which was her full attention. "Son, come here," she said. I walked over to her. I'm looking up. I'm probably about 5, maybe 6 years old at the time. And I remember she took her old gnarled fingers and put them on my shoulders and looked down. Now, I don't know how recently you've been around an older folks, but oftentimes they need someone to brace on. You know? And when I had her take a hold of my shoulders, even as a young boy, I remember thinking, she needs to brace. But then the next thing I realized was there was pressure on my shoulders, and she was getting down. And she was holding me to brace, but not for the reason I wanted. And eventually, she ended up in this position right here. Now, it was the first time in my young life that my grandmother and I had ever been what? Eye to eye. On the same level, if you were. Now, I didn't understand this at the time. I didn't know what was happening, but I liked it. I can even remember as a young boy thinking, this is special. Pay close attention. May not happen again. And as my grandmother's holding my shoulders, as she's looking deep into my eyes and as I'm returning that gaze, she said something to me some 50 plus years ago that I have never forgotten that I'm about to share with you now. She looked in my eyes and she said, "Shut up!" I wasn't expecting that. And quite frankly, I tried to recoil. I tried to run from her, and her grip tightened. And she actually drew me to her breast. And when she did, she wrapped her arms around me. And you can believe this or not, but I'm telling you the truth. Even this morning, I can still feel the compression in my mind's eye of that day. And when she had me totally immobilized, she whispered these words in my ear. "Son, don't you realize that when you're talking, you never learn anything? It's only when you're willing to shut up and listen that you might just learn something." Folks, as I said, that's been 50 plus years ago. And it's as true today as it was then. If we're willing to shut up and listen, even when the times are the most critical, even when things are happening that we could not have anticipated and that others want immediate answers to, if we can listen, we can learn. On the other hand, we must first learn to listen before we can learn.